Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Military Aviation Museum webinar. I'm Keegan Chetwynd, the museum director, and it's my pleasure to have you all here with us tonight. The subject tonight is the Memphis Belle, which has to be in contention for one of the most famous aircraft of all time. I don't think there's anyone in the warbird community or who's generally interested in World War II history that doesn't know the story of the first plane to complete 25 missions and return home. As with so many things, there are dimensions to the story that have become mythologized, and we are very fortunate to have Jeff Duford here with us tonight to examine this incredible historic airplane that's now on display at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. With us tonight, as I said, is Jeff Duford. Jeff is the lead curator and project manager for the Memphis Belle project. He was a curator and historian at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force from 1998 to 2021. That was a really exciting time for the Air Force Museum with a lot of expansion and exciting and interesting projects, the Memphis Belle being just one of them. In that time, Jeff curated numerous exhibits across the museum, worked closely with the museum's restoration division on more than 60 individual aircraft projects. He's been interviewed for national and international television productions and helped develop a rationalized aircraft layout and storyline for the museum's exhibit galleries. Jeff is now a senior historian at the Air Force Research Laboratory History Office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Jeff, you there with us? I think we're all excited to get started and learn more about the Belle.
I am, Keegan, and before I get started, I just wanted to say a big thanks to Keegan and to the Military Aviation Museum for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. I always love talking about the Belle, and thank you so much for the invitation. Tonight, I'm going to talk a lot about myths, because there are many, and what I hope that all the viewers walk away with, most importantly, is that the Memphis Belle is a national icon and an Air Force icon, both distinctly different and both very important parts of the Memphis Belle. I'm also going to talk about what happened to the Memphis Belle after the war, and then finally talk about the Memphis Belle coming to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, its restoration, and its display. And what we're looking at here on this first slide is the crew at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, mostly restoration. That's the team that restored the airplane. And I can't say enough about the talent and dedication of that group.
The Memphis Belle was known for many decades as the first heavy bomber to finish 25 missions. And of course, that's probably the biggest myth about the Memphis Belle. Of course, we know today that it was not, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But it has to be qualified, and the qualifier for that is that the Memphis Belle was the first heavy bomber to fly 25 missions over Europe and return home. And a big element of the Memphis Belle story is quite simply its fame. It's one of the most famous aircraft of all time, arguably one of the 5 most well-known aircraft, American aircraft of all time. And a big reason why the Memphis Belle was so famous is because it was selected to represent the heavy bomber crews on a nationwide war bond tour with lots of publicity and lots of excitement. And the crew in that airplane really represented the thousands of American airmen who were taking the fight to the Nazis in Europe in World War II. And to this day, the Memphis Belle represents the heavy bomber crews like no other aircraft. And what we're looking at on this slide here is some of the publicity. On the upper right is the co-pilot of the Memphis Belle, James Verinis, on a BBC show. On the bottom right is Hap Arnold in Washington, D.C., taking a look at the Belle when they first came back to the U.S. in June of 1943. And on the bottom in the middle, you see the King and Queen of England, who visited the crew before they left England. So a big part of the Memphis Belle story is its fame. And it was a first, but it was not the first. And I want to talk a little bit about that. This could be the subject of a whole nother lecture, and I'm not going to belabor it, but there was no single airplane that anyone can say was the first heavy bomber to finish 25 missions, because that heavy bomber was a B-17E in the Pacific that was flying in combat long before any of the B-17s or B-24s went to Europe. The reason why we don't know which one it was is because a lot of those records are pretty scant because of the nature of the war at the time. But we do know one airplane for sure, a B-17E called Suzy Q on the upper left there. That aircraft flew more than 25 missions in the Pacific and returned to the U.S. in October of 1942. So we know there was that one for sure was the first to fly 25 missions and return home. Could have been the first heavy bomber to fly 25 missions. We just don't know. On the upper right-hand side, we see hot stuff, and been a lot of talk about hot stuff in the last several years. First 8th Air Force heavy bomber to fly 25 missions, but there are a lot of errors in all published sources about hot stuff. In fact, hot stuff did not fly 25 bombing missions. It flew about 27 missions, and about a third of those missions were anti-submarine patrols over the Atlantic and the Bay of Biscay, and only a few of those missions were over Northern Europe. In fact, most of those missions were in North Africa, while hot stuff was attached to the 9th and 12th Air Forces. So on paper, it was a bomber in the 8th Air Force, but flew most of its missions in North Africa or against U-boats in the Atlantic. So, and at some point, I'm going to be writing an article about that. On the bottom left, Hell's Angels was known for the longest time as the first heavy bomber to finish 25 missions over Europe in the 303rd Bomb Group. But I went through and tracked all the bombers in the 8th Air Force in the first year or so of the bombing campaign using records at the National Archives, and discovered, along with the president of the 91st Bomb Group, Mick Hanu, that Delta Rebel was indeed the first Army Air Force's heavy bomber to fly 25 missions over Europe. And the Delta Rebel finished its 25th combat mission on the 1st of May. Hell's Angels finished its 25th mission on the 13th of May. And then the Memphis Belle finished its 25th mission on the 19th of May. So that's sort of the order of the famous B-17s over Europe. And fortunately, the 303rd Bomb Group was, their association was really great about looking at the evidence and agreeing with what the evidence said. So, but the Hells Angels had its own amazing life as well. It flew about 48 combat missions and then came back to the U.S. on its own war bond tour. Delta Rebel, unfortunately, was shot down on a mission on August 12, 1943, so it was destroyed. But there's one of many myths I'll talk about. There's a myth that the Memphis Belle was selected, or that Hells Angels was not selected, because it would be untoward. That having an airplane called Hells Angels would be indelicate, and so it wasn't selected for that. And that's just simply not true, because Hells Angels went on its own war bond tour, as I mentioned, around the U.S. later in the war, and also the first airplane picked, called Invasion 2. The nose art was a hand with the middle finger extended, but again, it was shot down over Bremen on the 17th of May 1940, or 17th of April 1943. So the Memphis Belle was selected to be this representative of the 8th Air Force and the heavy bomber crews that were flying over Europe. And it was during a crucial time in the heavy bomber campaign. We were losing crews left and right. Ultimately, in the fall, we were virtually defeated by the German Air Force. So it was really important that the American public supported the strategic bombing campaign, and the Memphis Belle was going to be the flagship for that. In addition to going around the country, went to over 33 locations in the continental U.S., the crew also visited some of the heavy bomber crews in training, and they told them things like, keep your formations tight and keep your eyes out for fighters, and things that would help those crewmen, help them survive when they were in combat in the skies over Europe. And some of the pictures that we're looking at here, there's a war bond that was actually signed by all the crew on the upper left, and ultimately was cashed. On the upper right is a picture of some female workers at Long Beach in California, and then in the middle is actually a picture of the Memphis Belle's pilot and co-pilot standing with Orville Wright at NCR in Dayton. And on the bottom left is the Memphis Belle at Patterson Field, which of course is now Wright-Patterson Field, and the place where the Memphis Belle is now preserved and displayed. Another important part of Memphis Belle's fame was William Weiler, famous Hollywood director. He actually won several Academy Awards as Best Director, and he really wanted to be part of the U.S. war effort. He's a great patriot, and I admire him greatly for what he did. And he contacted the Army Air Force and said, I want to help. I want to do something to help the war effort. And he was originally from France, the border region, Alsace-Lorraine, and he had emigrated to the U.S. He's Jewish, and he volunteered to do whatever he could do to help in the war effort. And so they sent him over to Europe and said, we want you to just get some film of heavy bomber operations. That was about all the instruction he got. That, and it was supposed to be a short, so maybe about a 15-minute long production. So he got a crew together and went over to England, and unfortunately all of their equipment was on a ship that was sunk by a German U-boat. So their sound equipment was lost, and all of their equipment was lost, and he had to scramble to find cameras, and ultimately he was able to do that. And he and his cameraman flew in combat. In fact, he flew 5 combat missions, including the Memphis Belle's crew's last mission on May 17, 1943. And one of his cameramen, Harold Tannenbaum, who was 47 years old and a World War I veteran, and a sound guy, now turned into a camera guy because the sound equipment was gone, was killed on a raid when he was with a B-24 outfit. He got out of the airplane, and unfortunately, when the chute popped, he somehow slipped out of his harness and fell to his death. So they took this footage, and Weiler knew how important this footage was, how important the story was. And so he pitched to the Army Air Forces that, hey, I can make a full movie with this footage, and it will be compelling to the American public. It will be compelling, tell a compelling story. And so he spent some months taking this footage and ended up making the 1944 movie, The Memphis Belle, A Story of a Flying Fortress. So as the Memphis Belle crew is going around the country on the war bond tour in the summer of 1943, Weiler is looking at this footage, developing a script, and ultimately through 1943 and early 44, putting this film together. So the film was shown to the President Roosevelt, and Roosevelt basically said, every American needs to see this movie. So it premiered in 1944, and millions of Americans saw it, and so it propelled what was already a famous airplane and crew. They were like rock stars by the end of the summer 1943. It just propelled them through the stratosphere. Everyone in America knew what the Memphis Belle was, knew who the crew were, so it really cemented their fame. And again, it came at the cost of Harold Tannenbaum and the risks that the crews were taking. But it really is an incredible documentary. And there's something else that Weiler's work did for us in preserving history far beyond just the movie The Memphis Belle, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So the fame of the Memphis Belle continued after the war in popular culture. So I'm sure that there are listeners out there who built the Revell model. I know I did as a kid. I had this model hanging from my ceiling when I was a little kid. And so people made models of the Memphis Belle. And then also there was the 1990 Hollywood movie about the Memphis Belle, and that's fictionalized. And so there's a lot of license taken, but it was actually co-produced by William Weiler's daughter, Catherine Weiler. So there was a family connection there. But it really brought the Belle's fame back again. And I think this is in Slovakian. So it was seen around the world again. But later in the 90s, the Memphis Belle's fame kind of started to fade. I was a little surprised when I started working on the project in the early 2000s that the name of the Memphis Belle was not known as well as it had in the past. So here's the first element of the Memphis Belle as an icon. The Memphis Belle is simply put an American, is an American icon. It's an icon in the same way that the Arizona is an icon to the Navy, and that the Iwo Jima flag is an icon to the Marine Corps and to the country. So when we see that flag, that picture of the flag being raised on Iwo Jima, it's more than just a picture. It's more than just an object, because it evokes thoughts and feelings of heroism and sacrifice and dedication. And it's so much more than just an object. It has such great meaning. And in Arizona, for those of you that have been fortunate to go out and see it, it's a hallowed place. It's a hallowed object. It also represents service and sacrifice and dedication to our country. And there is no other object that equals that for the U.S. Air Force. the heavy bomber crews during World War II in the fight against Germany sacrificed in ways never before or since in the air. There were more than 30,000 heavy bomber crewmen that were killed in the fight against Germany. And to put that in context, in all of World War II, there were 20,000 Marines killed in combat worldwide. And in Europe, in World War II, heavy bomber crews, there were more than 30,000 that sacrificed their lives in the fight against Germany. So the Memphis Belle is a true American icon. And I hope that when people see the Memphis Belle, they see pictures of it, that they have the same sort of emotion, the same sort of feelings that they do when they see the flag being raised on Mount Suribachi or when they see the USS Arizona. So in addition to being an American icon, the Memphis Belle is an Air Force icon. And the reason why it's an Air Force icon is because the daytime strategic bombing campaign in Europe was a huge experiment based on theory. The theory was that we could degrade or destroy an enemy's ability to prosecute war by destroying their tools, destroying the places that made the tools that will allow them to fight. So their infrastructure, their energy, their tank production, aircraft production, and so on. This had never been done before on this scale. The Germans had attempted some daylight bombing early in the war, but never to the scale of the Americans. We had bet the farm on the success of the strategic bombing campaign in World War II. And there's an important premise here that aircraft can be decisive and can do things beyond the front lines. And so without this strategic bombing campaign, it's difficult to argue the need for a separate service, because most of the other functions of the Army Air Forces at that time were largely supporting ground forces. So the strategic bombing campaign in World War II did essentially three things. First, it made D-Day possible by degrading and breaking the back of the German Air Force, which gave the Allies near total air supremacy over the beaches on D-Day. We had to have that. Without air supremacy, there's no D-Day, and that's because of the daytime strategic bombing campaign. And the two other things that the strategic bombing campaign did later into 1944 and especially into early 1945 is that they nearly destroyed Germany's energy production, primarily fuel production, which severely hampered German ground forces. And they also finally wrecked the German infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, particularly rail and bridges. So those three major contributions, allowing D-Day, destruction of German energy, and finally destruction of German transportation infrastructure, were important contributions to the Allies winning in Europe in World War II. And then, of course, the later campaign, strategic campaign against Japan, was decisive. So the Memphis Belle represents the heavy bomber crews in the fight against Germany, and the Memphis Belle and those crews represent decisive air power behind and beyond enemy lines. And that's an argument that's used to create a separate Air Force, which of course happens in 1947, 2 years after the war ends. So I see the Memphis Belle not only as an American icon, but also as a symbol of that idea of decisive air power beyond the front lines that creates the U.S. Air Force just a few years after the war ends. So there are many, many Memphis Belle myths, and I will probably miss a few of them. And if I do, I hope they come up in the questions afterwards. There's a great book called Dispelling the Myths about the Memphis Belle. It's about 500 pages long. And if you're interested in reading more, I would definitely recommend getting that book because there are many. And in part, it's because of the Army Air Forces, because some of these myths were sold during the war because it's too complex to put on a bumper sticker. So they made it a very simple, compelling story. I think it doesn't change the important facts about the Belle, the bravery of the crews, and the fact that they represented those crews. But nevertheless, now with the advance of time and the ability to nail down the facts, it's important that we be truthful and we know the full story. And you know, what's ironic is that with many myths, when you actually learn the full story, it actually makes it a richer story than the myth. So in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of the Memphis Belle's original crew. 8 of those crew members flew most of their missions together, and most of those missions on the Memphis Belle. So the myth is that the Memphis Belle crew flew, all 10 flew all of their missions together, and all 25 of their missions on the Memphis Belle. That did not happen. But 8 of the 10 original crew flew most of their missions together, and they flew 20 of their missions on the Memphis Belle. Now, those 5 other missions, the Memphis Belle was either being repaired from combat damage or being modified. So that's the reason why they flew in a different bomber on 5 missions. On the bottom left, you see the so-called list of Memphis Belle's combat missions. That's not actually Memphis Belle's missions. That's Robert Morgan's missions, the Memphis Belle's aircraft commander. Those are the missions he flew. So 5 of those missions on there, he was flying a different airplane. On the upper right-hand photo, you'll see there's a gunner on the left, and that's Scott Miller. And then the next photo down, I'm going to use the pointer here. Right here is Scott Miller, and he joined the crew on the 9th mission. He was actually an autopilot maintainer. And honest to gosh, I talked to his daughter, and she said he got bored, and he didn't really like working on them because they were really complicated. It was kind of a pain. So he thought it'd be easier to fly combat, and so he got on the crew on the 9th mission. So when the core crew, those 8 crewmen, finished their 25th mission on May 17th, he was kind of stuck. It was his 16th mission, and they really wanted him to come on the war bond tour, but he had not flown 25 missions, so he had to stay. And so while the crew was on the war bond tour in the U.S., he's still flying combat missions. With another crew on a different airplane, and he finished his 25th mission on July 4th, and thankfully survived. But unfortunately for Scott Miller, because he wasn't on the war bond tour, he ended up kind of disappearing. He's sort of the missing crew member, and that's addressed in the exhibit around the Memphis Belle, fortunately. And on the bottom right is Tony Nestal. He from Detroit, Michigan. He actually flew only 1 combat mission on the Memphis Belle, and that was as a tail gunner. And he was picked to go with the crew on the war bond tour. So he was really not part of that crew. And on top of it, they said, well, and you were the right-hand waist gunner, right waist gunner. So he had to go around the country saying, I was the right waist gunner on the Memphis Belle when he really wasn't. And then another element of the crew is the co-pilot, James Verinis. I'm pointing to him here. He flew 5 combat missions as the co-pilot of the Memphis Belle, but he was certainly qualified to be an aircraft commander of his own aircraft, which after 5 missions, he was given an airplane that he named the Connecticut Yankee, and he flew the rest of his combat tour as an aircraft commander for Connecticut Yankee. But then for the Warbond tour, he had to go around the country as Robert Morgan's co-pilot. So, but they did what was good for the country and what was right for the country, and it was a good story. So I mentioned that the Memphis Belle crew finished their 25th mission on May 17th. So that was the core crew. That's 8 of the 10. And in the end, there were more than 40 airmen who flew at least 1 combat mission on the Memphis Belle, because those 5 missions that the Memphis Belle crew did not fly in the airplane, there was an entirely different crew. And then sometimes there were observers as well. So we're looking at a picture of the Memphis Belle's crew chief painting the 25th bomb on. That's Jambroni is his name. And then on the bottom, you see the Memphis Belle crew giving sort of a staged celebration of finishing the 25th mission. So I want to talk about the Memphis Belle's restoration, and it really does begin with the end of the combat tour, because once the Belle finished its combat tour, shortly after it was transferred out of the 91st Bomb Group, and the Memphis Belle had some pretty rough times between then and the time that it got restored. And some of the photos you're looking at here on the upper left is when the Belle first made it to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in 2005. And on the upper right is there's the restoration crew, and then they're doing some of the work. So the Memphis Belle, when it came back, went on the war bond tour, went around the country, and then when the war bond tour was over at the end of the summer of 1943, the Belle went to Boeing and got an overhaul, major overhaul, and then it went to Florida. And it was used as a training aircraft in 1944 and going into 1945. So it's kind of interesting because we have the records of the maintenance records of the Memphis Belle, and we've had some children and grandchildren of pilots who said, hey, my grandfather or my dad said he flew in the Belle when he was training to go over to Europe, and we've been able to confirm those for the families by looking at the maintenance records. So at the end of the war, the Memphis Belle was sent to a boneyard in Altus, Oklahoma. And it's a little surprising for us now to look back and think, gosh, how could they have put that in a boneyard to be melted down? It's the Memphis Belle. And looking at the scale of World War II and just the enormous mobilization, 15 million Americans in uniform, it's easy to understand how that airplane could kind of get lost in the shuffle when the war ended. The service people just wanted to get back to their lives. They wanted to work and raise their families and build houses. And so the Memphis Belle was not the only aircraft that was sort of lost in the mix. Hell's Angels is another one. It ended up getting melted down. And behind the Memphis Belle is the famous 5,000 or $5,000, the 5,000th B-24 made. That was melted down. So the Memphis Belle really was in danger when it was sitting in Altus. And I think very likely it would have simply been melted down along with many other, just like many other famous aircraft from World War II. But thankfully, the city of Memphis really saved the Memphis Belle. And they bought it for $300 and made it airworthy. And it was flown from Altus to Memphis. And then it was put on a block in 1945. And unfortunately, for 30 years after that, it was exposed to the weather and to vandals. So there were items that were taken off of it. Also, the Air Force had taken some of the instruments out as well. So it really went through a rough patch for about 30 years, but it existed. And had Memphis not obtained the airplane in the late 1940s, there would have been nothing to restore in the 2000s. So in the late 70s, the Memphis Belle was looking pretty rough, sitting on that concrete block. And what was then the Air Force Museum, now the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, was taking great interest in the airplane and concerned about its condition. The mayor of Memphis actually relinquished possession of the Memphis Belle back to the Air Force, officially gave the title back to the Air Force. At the same time, the Memphis Belle Memorial Association was created, and the Memphis Belle Memorial Association, MBMA, raised funds, an enormous amount of funds, to restore the Memphis Belle and put it on display. So up until then, it was the city was responsible, and so the Air Force Museum allowed the MBMA to take care of the airplane, restore the airplane. And what you're looking at in the upper pictures are pictures of the Belle when the paint was stripped off and during the restoration process. And then for many of you listening, on the bottom, you recognize the Memphis Belle on Mud Island underneath a tent. So that tent-like structure was certainly better than the Memphis Belle sitting on that concrete plinth, but it was still exposed to birds and to some degree the elements. And so it was not ideal. It was better than it was, but certainly not ideal. So in the early 2000s, there was a real push to do a full restoration of the aircraft, and it really needed it. And basically, in discussions with the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force and the MBMA, there was essentially an ultimatum that the airplane would be fully restored, put in a museum, and seen by, I think it was something like 200,000 people per year. And so the MBMA did a study to see, is this possible? Can we raise enough money? And would we be able to meet these requirements? And to their great credit, they didn't try to drag their feet or try to obfuscate. They did an honest study, and they determined in this study that they would not be able to meet these requirements. And so they said, come get the airplane. And I can't say enough for the folks down in Memphis. They continued to support the restoration all the way through, and to this day, there are still a few parts we're looking for. The MBMA is looking for those parts, and occasionally they find them and send them up. The artifacts that they had, the archival materials they had, we didn't even ask for them. The National Museum did not even ask for these things. They were willingly transferred. And the MBMA came up periodically to see how the airplane was progressing. And so they didn't just turn the airplane over and walk away and keep what they had. They were generous in their donations. And it was hard at first, and understandably. I think there were so many people down in Memphis that gave their own time, thousands of hours, and their own money to take care of the airplane. And so when the restoration crew went down to get the airplane in 2005, there were some hard feelings. But by the time the airplane was restored, and the people in Memphis that were still frustrated, when they saw what was being done at the Air Force's National Museum, they understood that it really was a better place. The airplane would be cared for much better because of the resources at the Air Force's National Museum, and also that it would be seen by more people. So in the end, just before the opening of the airplane and the exhibit at the National Museum of the Air Force, I actually went down to Memphis and spoke to the folks in Memphis and talked about what we were doing. And basically what it really comes down to is when you look at the life of that aircraft and what it is today and how it got there, it was kind of like a relay race. There were many laps that were run, and the National Museum of the Air Force ran the last lap and got the publicity of running across the finish line. But the folks in Memphis did a really important part of that race and ran several laps that a lot of people really don't know. And so there have been some who have disparaged Memphis for letting the airplane get as bad as it did. That happened in the 50s and 60s. That was before the MBMA took care of it. And also, if Memphis had not obtained the airplane in the late 40s, the airplane would have been destroyed and there would be nothing to talk about. So Memphis was a great partner and should be commended for preserving the aircraft. So when the Memphis Belle first came to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in October 2005, the first step was basically to assess the condition. And there was corrosion and that had to be dealt with, but it was not as bad as our restoration crews had feared. So one of the things that had been done on the Memphis Belle was to paint the inside. So you can see in these photos, this olive drab that's on the skin on the inside, that's not original. Surprisingly, most B-17s had very little interior paint. So going through the radio room, after the radio room and the fuselage where the waist gunners are, it's just not painted. But a lot of the warbirds have been painted after the fact, probably for corrosion control, but they were simply unpainted during the war. So all of that paint had to be stripped. There was some corrosion, like you can see on the ring, the turret ring of the top turret here. Again, on the bottom left here, you see a lot of overspray. That's not original. So the first step was to remove the paint. And because the inside of a B-17 is not a flat surface, it was challenging and laborious and took quite some time. And you can see on the upper left, there's the Memphis Belle as it came to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. And then on the bottom right, you can see what it looked like when the paint was all stripped off. And then here's another example outside of the tail turret. All that had to be stripped inside and outside. There were no original markings on the exterior of the aircraft that were removed. That's occasionally we've gotten some angry emails at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force about the nose art being stripped, original nose art. The original nose art was stripped in the 80s. So there was no original exterior paint that was removed at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. And then here are some examples of name carvings. This was really interesting. As the paint was stripped away, there are literally hundreds of names where folks on the war bond tour, service people at the bases, got out their pocket knives and carved their names into the metal of the aircraft. And all of those names were documented, and they were all put together on a spreadsheet, photographed. They are noted by aircraft station. So it's a way to, aircraft station is a way to mark a specific point on an airplane. So we know where all of these names are. Right now, they're all covered by paint. But if somebody decides someday that they need to be uncovered, that is reversible. But the names are photographed and documented in a spreadsheet, hundreds of them. And we have had a few children and grandchildren say, my dad or my mom said that she carved her name in the Memphis Belle on the tail turret, or they tell us where, and we've been able to confirm those as well. I was kind of laughed because I think, could you imagine going to an air show now and going up to an Air Force F-16 or F-15 and try to do that? So I guess it's different times. So I want to talk a little bit about the research with the restoration of the aircraft. What you're looking at is one of the maintenance log books that the folks in Memphis transferred to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. You can see Giambroni had put his name on it, crew chief for the Memphis Belle, and this is the cover of the maintenance log for August to December 1942. We have the logs going all the way to the end of the war, and it lists things like repairs, modifications, engine changes, propeller changes, pilots who are flying it. It's an incredible record. And the maintenance logs were at the Memphis Belle Public Library and were part of their collection. And the Memphis Belle Public Library could very easily have just said, this is part of our collection, we'll make a copy for you, but we're not going to give it, we're not going to transfer it. We didn't even have to ask for it. It was transferred to us. The NBMA worked that. So the maintenance logs are invaluable to document the changes made for the airplane. But that's just one research source. There were many research sources that we had. National Archives were particularly important. We made several trips to the National Archives, scanned tens of thousands of documents. Also, the Air Force Historical Research Agency down in Alabama. We received more than 100,000 pages of documents. The ones that were primarily the most important from AFRA were from the 8th Air Force Service Command, and that was the organization in the 8th Air Force that modified and did heavy depot repair, heavy maintenance. And then finally, we went to the Boeing Archives in Washington, and they were very helpful as well. So here's an example of a document from the National Archives. This is an interrogation form. So this is basically an intelligence debrief. This is from the crew's last mission. And these documents are absolutely fantastic. They're all preserved at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. And if there's anyone listening out here who has a relative that flew in the 8th Air Force, or 9th or 12th or 15th for that matter, and you want to know more about their service if they flew, there's a very good chance that their intelligence debriefs are preserved at the National Archives at College Park, and you can reconstruct their entire campaign by using these documents. It's laborious to do, but the documents are there to do that. So these types of documents allow us to know for sure who is on the Belle, what kind of bomb load they were carrying, exactly what happened. Like, for instance, we know that the Memphis Belle was damaged on 7 of its missions, in part because of these intelligence debriefs. And we can say that with certainty. There's also things like formation charts. There's victory claims, which on the next slide here, we'll see that. Here's a victory claim for Bill Winchell. And this was actually on that same mission, on the last mission of the crew. And you can see that it's stamped destroyed. So his victory was confirmed. He shot down an FW-190 that was attacking from about 9 o'clock position on the left-hand side. With these documents and going through them, we know with certitude who flew on the Belle, when they flew on, all these different details. So, for instance, one way that we've used these documents is the Memphis Belle carried 5 1,000-pound M44 high-explosive demolition bombs on that mission on the 17th of May. So we had reproduction M44s made that you cannot tell the difference. I can't tell from 10 feet away. I can't tell them apart from a real bomb. And those 5 reproduction bombs were put in the Memphis Belle last month. The most important source of information by far were the so-called outtakes. What they are is it's the stock film from William Weiler and his film crews. And it is unbelievable. If I had to pick an airplane to have this much documentation, it would be the Memphis Belle. There are 11 and a half hours of footage in this stock film. And the wonderful thing about it is that all of the listeners here, you can watch this film on YouTube, because about 2 years ago, the National Archives put all 34 reels on YouTube. If you just go there and search Memphis Belle outtakes, it's silent, but all of it is in color. There are some stage scenes, like, for instance, the famous roll by of the Memphis Belle when they just finished their 25th mission. That was a staged scene, and they did it 3 times. So you can watch all 3. And this footage is all in color. There are some candid moments. There's one moment where the Memphis Belle squadron commander pops the middle finger to the camera. Of course, that didn't make it into the 1944 movie. But it's incredible what's in this footage, not just about the Memphis Belle, but also about the operations that are going on at the bases. And you can see how young they are. You know, the average age was about 22, 23. On the Belle, the youngest crew member was 19, oldest is 26. And it's just incredible footage. But in the case of the Memphis Belle, the Memphis Belle shows up in this footage. Earliest was about December 1942. And on the upper right-hand side, you can see the Belle has about 7 bombs. So it had flown about 7 missions at that point. And you can see the markings are pretty sparse. And also, too, the nose doesn't have 50 caliber machine guns in it. And so that's the first time we see the Belle chronologically in these outtakes. And the last time we see the Belle is in the late summer of 1943 at Long Beach. And the Belle shows up periodically in these outtakes, including flying on a bomb run with the bomb bay doors open and a big hole blown into the rudder. It's incredible. So what it did for us at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force is that it gave us this incredible visual record of how the airplane was marked and how it was configured. And it's inarguable about how the airplane was configured, because records are records. Some records are more reliable than others, but original film that is properly, the date is properly identified, is just invaluable. And so as a result of these outtakes, we were able to configure and mark the Memphis Belle with incredible accuracy. And one thing in particular, on the upper left hand here, you see Irene, and that was the Hanson's wife. And that doesn't show up in any of the models or any of the restorations of the Belle. You know, look at that close up. You know, our restoration staff was able to paint that accurately because they had that model to go from. And so there are countless examples of material we use from the outtakes to make sure that we restored the aircraft accurately. So this is a difficult part of the restoration. Now, the Memphis Belle, one of the wonderful things about it was that it was there very early in the heavy bombing campaign, but that also made its restoration much more difficult. So when the 8th Air Force first went over to England, first started sending crews over and bombers over, the British told 8th Air Force authorities and our Air Force's leaders that, hey, you need to be ready to modify these airplanes, because when you start flying in combat, you're going to discover things that are problems, and you're going to need to fix them quick, or you're going to lose people. And we, in our great confidence, us Americans, said, oh, no, our airplanes are good. We won't need to do that. The only plans we made were to fix factory defects that might be on the airplanes that come over, but we had no plans whatsoever to modify the airplanes. And of course, the British were right. They had combat experience, and so we were really, really in a bind. And so the Memphis Belle received modifications sometimes in the shops at Bassingbourn, and there's no record. There are no drawings. There's no record. And so a lot of the modifications were done using, again, this imagery from the William Weiler outtakes. And here's a really important one. On the upper left here, you see the nose of the Memphis Belle. This is probably about December 1942, maybe January 1943. And you see the nose looks pretty bare. That black line is actually the 50 caliber machine gun of the right cheek position, and there are no guns in the nose. And the reason why there are no guns in the nose is because those rings were fitted for 30 caliber machine guns, not 50s. 50s would have shattered the plexiglass. And they were so useless that a lot of crews didn't even carry them on missions. So we know that the Memphis Belle is about to take off on a combat mission in this scene, because there's the Norden bomb site. And they always took care to cover it up or take it off in all these other shots. Somebody made a mistake in allowing this to be actually shot. So we know it's taking off on a combat mission, and you can see there are no guns in the nose. So the Germans figure this out, and they start attacking from the front famously, and our bombers are virtually defenseless. So we need to get 50 caliber machine guns in the nose. There are about 10 different ways that 8th Air Force maintainers figured out how to put 50s in the nose. In the case of the Memphis Belle, they created these things called spiders, and you can see them here. They're basically reinforcements that go to that ring that take the strain and recoil of a 50 caliber and transfer it to the structure of the aircraft and not through the plexiglass. And there were 200 of these spider kits made at Langford Lodge in Northern Ireland, and it was a Lockheed contract facility. And we know when they were shipped to Bassingbourn, but there were no drawings. But fortunately, with the imagery and the outtakes from William Weiler and his cameramen, along with some photographs, our restoration staff reproduced them exactly. So they understood that they were welded basically, and there were some holes that were still in the bulkheads of the Memphis Belle, so they could locate where the bolts went. And so on the left, you see the nose spiders in the Memphis Belle. And then on the right, you see the nose spiders that they were fabricated by the amazing restoration staff at the museum. Another modification was a British navigation system, and we called it a towel rack because that's kind of what it looks like. But you can see the antenna here, and this is the Memphis Belle in Washington on the picture on the upper right. That you can see the towel rack. On the bottom left, you can see kind of a close-up of the towel rack, and that's at Long Beach in California. So this is on the War Bond tour. And so it's a British system that was put on some B-17s. It's a radio navigation system. And so we went and contacted some folks in the UK. And on the upper left, you can see the drawing of how that antenna is manufactured. And so the restoration crew used that drawing, followed the instructions, and you can see the antenna on the Memphis Belle on the bottom right. So again, identical. In this case, we were very fortunate because we had drawings because it was a British system. Here's another example of a modification. Most B-17s on the tail had a red light and a white light. And this, on the Memphis Belle on the upper left here, you can see this is after the tail got peppered. You can see the holes in it on a particularly bad mission. And this is a British system. So it had 4 lights, and it was basically a visual identification friend or foe that they would put on their bombers at night. And the Memphis Belle had this system. So when the Memphis Belle came to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, on the bottom left here, you can see it didn't have that system. But fortunately, again, because it was a British system, we were able to obtain a drawing of how that was manufactured. And on the bottom right, you can see the reproduction that was manufactured by the restoration staff. So I can't say enough about the talent and what they can do in the shops at the National Museum of the Air Force. It's identical to the original device. And then something while we're on these photos, just to point out this kind of a humorous thing. In this black and white photo on the upper left, you can see there's a dark spot of paint just above Pete. And there's no record of how this happened, but I'm confident that we know what happened. The tail gunner Quinlan put in for shooting down an FW-190, and he was sure he had shot it down. He was absolutely sure he had shot it down. And we have a copy of that victory claim, and it was denied. I think they gave him a probable or damaged. And he went ahead and painted a swastika on that tail position, and then was told to paint it out because it was not confirmed. And so there's a little bit darker of a spot above Pete where he did that. So the restoration crews have reproduced that sort of darker spot of OD paint on the Memphis Belle today. And what's kind of humorous is later on, Winchell painted another swastika on the tail. So in the end, he was able to do that, but that was after they'd finished the combat tour. So here's a one of many happy ending stories. The Memphis Belle's, the left side of its instrument panel was removed from the airplane and given to a Boeing executive as part of a table given to this executive when he retired. And so here's a picture of that table in the upper right. Pretty amazing. And eventually that panel was taken out of the table and donated to the National Museum of the Mighty Eighth. And they had it on display for many, many years. And to their great credit, instead of continuing to display it, they transferred it to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force to once again be joined with the aircraft. And on the bottom left, you see the director, Skipper, and we had a presentation and a formal turnover ceremony, but just a wonderful example of responsibility and doing the right thing, because that was a great artifact for them to have on display at the National Museum of the Mighty Eighth. It's right in their mission, but it is in the airplane and is now back with the Memphis Belle thanks to their generosity and professionalism. So I want to talk a little bit about the colors and markings. This was pretty challenging. That just like any other combat aircraft, the markings changed over time. And it's ironic that this happens actually with many airplanes. The by far the greatest number of photos of the Memphis Belle are when it was on the war bond tour. And that is not how the airplane looked for most of its career. And but with so many images of it, one can think, well, that's how it's supposed to look. So what we're looking at here, this is film of the Memphis Belle crew right after they finished the 25th mission. This is the real deal. This is not staged. They have just come off the airplane. The reason why it was not used in the movie is because when it was processed, somebody messed it up and there's blue lines in it. So it made it unusable. So if you happen to go through that footage on YouTube and you come across this is the real deal. And what's ironic is on the right there, you see Jambrone painting the 25th bomb on the airplane. What you see in the movie close up, the 1944 movie, is actually Jambrone painting on a 26th bomb. They just wanted him to paint a bomb on the airplane. So he painted the 26th bomb for the camera, and then they very quickly wiped off the wet paint off the airplane. So this is a still from the Memphis Belle crew finishing their 25th mission on May 17th. So on the bottom is what most of us are familiar with seeing with the Memphis Belle nose. It's the 8 swastikas underneath the bombs and the crew names. And these were not added on until 2 to 3 weeks after the Memphis Belle finished its combat tour. So the Memphis Belle did not fly combat with the crew names on it, and the Memphis Belle did not fly combat with those swastikas under the bombs. It did have swastikas at the crew positions. So Chuck Layton, the navigator, did shoot down an FW-190, or was given official credit for shooting down an FW-190. So that was on the airplane. I think it's kind of interesting how it's asymmetric. It's not very well executed, not very even, but that wasn't overly important. And also the bombs are pretty uneven as well. And then there were some stars that were added after the combat tour. Why, I'm not sure, but nevertheless, there were some that were added. So that's just a few examples. But again, we go back to this great source material, the outtakes, the stock footage from William Weiler and his cameramen. And so, for instance, you can see S underneath the left waist gun position. That ended up becoming Sally a few weeks after the 25th mission. So we have a really great record to be able to understand how the airplane was marked and when it was marked that way. So we've termed these additional markings after the 25th mission the publicity markings, because basically it became a flying billboard, and that's understandable. So there was another swastika painted underneath the left waist gun position. S became Sally. They painted Winchell's name at that position. They added swastikas underneath both sides where the bombs were. And then again, I'd mentioned the missions that were listed on the tail were not the Memphis Belle's missions. They were the aircraft commander Morgan's missions. And so these publicity markings contributed to some of the myths. People looked at the tail of the Belle and said, that's the missions that the Memphis Belle flew. And of course, that's not accurate. So the publicity markings are a very important part of the Memphis Belle story. But we decided, after careful consideration and thought, that the most significant moment of the Memphis Belle was right after they finished the 25th mission. So that's the moment in time that the Memphis Belle is marked at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. So sometime in the first few days after they flew that 25th mission are the markings for the Memphis Belle. And then in the exhibit that's around it, there's imagery and interpretation about the publicity markings, because that is an important part of the story. But the artifact itself is represented as it was during its most important moment. And then the overall colors were something of a challenge too. The olive drab that was in use, it's called dark olive drab number 41. And it was so unstable that there are actually two contemporary articles about how ultraviolet broke down that paint. And for those of you that have looked at color photos of dark olive drab aircraft, particularly 8th Air Force aircraft, they turn all kinds of strange colors. Sometimes they turn sort of purplish. Sometimes it's brown. That the OD just breaks down in kind of strange ways. And normally at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, we didn't try to match colors, faded colors, because that's pretty difficult to do. But we just couldn't deny that the Memphis Belle really did not look like it did when it left the factory. And part of the problem with trying to match those colors is that even with color film, the footage is taken at different times of the day and from different angles. So the sun's, could be noon, it could be 5 in the evening, it could be 9 in the morning, and the color goes all over the place. So we tried a couple different methods to try and understand how the color shifted and lightened using a system called Munsell. But what you can see in some of these photos too, there wasn't just one shade of olive drab. So because the rudder is made out of fabric, it can be painted the exact same color with the same paint, but it's going to reflect the light differently. So it just, and you can see the dramatic difference in shade. And then also, if you look at the vertical, and this was very common actually, because the verticals were painted in a different place. They're a major subassembly. And if you look at a color photo of a B-17 in 1942, 43, they all had, the verticals were a different shade of OD. And so we decided that we would try to match these colors as best as is humanly possible. So there's basically 3 shades of olive drab. There's the main olive drab, there's the vertical tail, and then there's the fabric control surfaces. And actually, on top of all of that, the tail that the Memphis Belle came home with, the vertical, is not the one that it came to England with. On one of the missions, the Memphis Belle tail was severely damaged, and the vertical had to be completely replaced. So it was a different airplane's vertical that was repainted and put on the Memphis Belle. So one method to try and understand the color shift was to take pictures and turn original color imagery into black and white, and then do the same to just make sure that we got the darkness accurate. And we actually went through, good example, the color for the rudder was mixed. We went through more than 25 mixes of color before we felt we found the right shade. And it has the one that was used for the control surfaces, the rudder and other control surfaces, actually has 9 different pigments in it. And we went late into the night, into the evening, trying to get that color right with our paint contractor. So we went to great lengths to try and match that color as close as is humanly possible. And something else that really helped too is at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, there are original paint samples that were given to manufacturers during the war, and they've been kept in darkness and refrigerated, and they have not shifted. So that gave us a good starting point to start there, and then use the Munsell system to try and understand the color shift. And I do believe that the Memphis Belle is as close as is humanly possible to the shade that it was in May of 1943. So the nose art was something of a surprise for all of us. We were so used to seeing such the gorgeous nose art that we see in illustrations, and it caused some consternation for all of us. On the left, you see is the original pinup that the Memphis Belle is based on, and that was in Esquire magazine in April of 1941. And then you see there's a close-up of the nose art on the right, and it's really kind of poorly executed. It's kind of sloppy. And Casey Simmons, who's one of our just outstanding restoration craftsmen, he painted the Memphis Belle on the left-hand side, and he was really worried. He has a degree in archaeology. He's a licensed power plant and airframe guy, A&P guy, and he builds acoustic guitars from scratch at home in his spare time. So he's kind of a modern Renaissance man. But he was worried if I paint it like this, people are going to think I'm terrible. And in the end, we all agreed there was no other choice. And he agreed too. We have to try and replicate it as closely as possible to how it looked. And he did just a fantastic job. And thankfully, when we look at it on the airplane, it looks fine. But that was a surprise to us because we were so used to seeing this gorgeous nose art. And what was actually on the plane is really not quite as neat. And what we're looking at here is on the upper left, this is a still from the Memphis Belle's crew's 25th mission when they just got back on the 17th of May. It's a still from Weiler's outtakes. In the middle is the nose art as it was painted on the Memphis Belle when it was in Memphis during the restoration in the 1980s. And then on the right is a close-up of the Memphis Belle nose art as it's painted on the Memphis Belle now. So Casey did a fantastic job executing it. We also worked with our exhibits designers about getting the illustration right. They went down to counting rivets, and they just did an absolutely amazing job. So here's an example of some of the little details with the markings that might not be so obvious. There's a lot of things with the markings that people are never going to see. And with the restoration, no one is ever going to see these things. But we know that they were there. We know how it was done. And so the restoration crew reproduced these things as they were. One example is the stencils on the props. There's a standard stencil that goes on B-17 props, and it's on 3 sets of the props, but for whatever reason, it's not on the number 1 engine. I don't know, maybe the props were overhauled and they just didn't stencil them, but it's in every photo at the late part of the Memphis Belle's combat tour. They're just not there. So there's no stencils on the Memphis Belle's #1 engine. An example of the restoration that no one's ever going to see is the Radiator, which is just inboard of the #2 engine, and it's a heat exchanger basically to provide heat for the heating system for about half the crew. The Belle didn't have it, and it's very complex. It's a radiator kind of device with all these fins and everything, and the restoration crew reproduced this radiator from Boeing drawings exactly, put it inside the wing, and no one is ever going to see it probably until the wing is open for some reason when we're all long gone. But it's there, it's accurate, and that was the philosophy of the restoration crew, and my philosophy as well. It doesn't matter if people see it or not. There's right and there's wrong, and it's that simple. And this is a national treasure, a national icon. It's sacred to us, to the Air Force, to the country. So it was about doing it right. Here's another example of the markings. In the restoration of the Memphis Belle, in some places where there were decals, the information was hand painted, which doesn't look like a decal. But for the most part, the decals were not applied. So B-17Fs had several decals inside and out, and the Memphis Belle only had a few on the inside, and all the external decals were long gone. So in the instructions, in the Boeing drawings, there are instructions for all the decals, their size, the color, and so on. And so all of those decals were reproduced. We had them reproduced by a contractor. They're water transfer decals, basically like the kind that you put on models, scale models. And we made sure that the font was correct. It's a fantastic Art Deco font, and so all of the decals that were on the Memphis Belle are on it, and some of them were painted over, like you can see on the upper left there. That's on the nose, on the left-hand side, and so they put the decal on, and they painted over it just like that was done. There's one decal that's pierced by a modification for the drift meter on the left-hand side of the nose, and so all those things were done just like the Memphis Belle was appeared in 1943. So if you go take a look at the airplane, you go visit and take a look around and see where the decals are. It's pretty neat. They're all over the airplane. So here's the Memphis Belle in early May of 2018, and it was a Saturday morning, and we were trying to keep the nose art kind of hidden so there would be some surprise and some build up some excitement. So to try and keep that from being found out before the unveiling, it was very early on a Saturday morning, and the restoration crew pulled the Belle out, and we got some beautiful photographs. The weather was cooperating with us that day, thankfully. So this is before the formal rollout and opening of the exhibit. And here's a picture of the Memphis Belle as it's on display today. And once again, I just want to sing praise for the restorers. The way that the Memphis Belle is displayed is because of them. We knew we had to get the airplane up in some fashion, and I thought the way to do it would be to have the gear down, put it on short stands, and have the tail up in the air. And one of the restoration guys said, "Hey, why don't we just put it on stands, and then we can open the bomb bay? It'll be like it's on the bomb run." And I said, "Well, that sounds great. Let's do that." And so there's 4 jack points on the underside of a B-17F, and the Belle sits on 3 points. There's one stand under each of the wings into a jack point, and it's screwed in there, and there's a secondary device that's in there in case the first device should fail. So it's not just sitting in there, it's actually screwed into the structure of the airplane. And then there's a stand at the tail wheel, and the restoration staff not only designed the stand, they also made it. There's a plate steel that they cut and welded, and then they put the Belle on top of it. And it was very, very important for all of us that we allowed the public, we allowed everyone to get as close to the airplane as possible without anyone damaging it or touching it. And so by putting it on display in the fashion that it is, you can get underneath a lot of the airplane, get underneath the wings. You can peek into the bomb bay. You can really get close and be in the presence of the artifact, but it's still being protected, which is just fantastic. And then the area out in front of the Memphis Belle is wide open, so you can get a nice long view. And it's also set up in such a way it's a great place to get a picture underneath the nose art on either side. And then the Memphis Belle is displayed in the same fashion that it is as an icon and as a symbol of the heavy bomber crews. The Memphis Belle exhibit is actually two exhibits. So there's a core exhibit about the Memphis Belle around the aircraft, and then on the exterior wall around the Memphis Belle is the story of the strategic bombing campaign, which again, half of the Air Force's combat deaths in its entire history were heavy bomber crewmen in the fight against Germany. That other half is World War I, all the other crews in World War II, so everyone in the Pacific, CBI, the fighters, 9th Air Force, and Korea, Vietnam, and operations in the last 20 years. So half of the Air Force's combat deaths were crewmen flying in B-17s and B-24s against Germany. So it's sacred to the Air Force and its story, and that's in part why the Memphis Belle, the museum, the Air Force's National Museum, put so much effort, so much emphasis on the Memphis Belle. In essence, it's the Air Force's flag being raised on Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima. And if you haven't gone to visit, if you've never been to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, it's an amazing place. It's enormous. It's about 19 acres under roof. And the Memphis Belle is really a gem on top of what is already a pretty amazing place. So here's a close-up of the Memphis Belle's nose. The restoration, the interior restoration, was not completed before it went on display. We made the decision that rather than rush the interior restoration, we thought it was very important that the Memphis Belle went on display on its 75th anniversary, its 75th anniversary of its 25th mission. And that's what the museum did. It went on public display on the 17th of May in 2018. And actually what's kind of nice, this presentation today is on the 78th anniversary of the airplane's 25th mission on May 19th, 1943. So that worked out kind of nice. But the interior restoration continues, and they expect to have it completed sometime later this year. And when it's done, the museum will do 360 imagery from the nose all the way to the rear. They've done that with several airplanes at the museum. They'll do high-resolution 360-degree shots where you can spin a view around and zoom in close and things like that. So you'll get the opportunity to see the great work of the restoration crews. And there's a nice photo from up on a stand. And then you can see here is the entrance to the Memphis Belle exhibit. And in the distance, you can see the introductory panel for the strategic bombing exhibit. And then underneath the left wing of the Memphis Belle, this is the heart of the Memphis Belle display. It's all the core crew, and there are artifacts from 7 of the 10 Memphis Belle crew members on display. And what I find remarkable is these objects are on display literally in the shadow of the airplane that they flew in. So there's uniform and gear and things like that the Memphis Belle crew members wore while they were on that airplane. So when you get in that spot, it's pretty amazing to think that all these things are together with the airplane. And then some of that great color footage that's in the outtakes is on display. There are 2 videos that are in the exhibit. So you really see the different personalities of the crew members and right there with the airplane on display. So here's just a few of the artifacts that are on display. One of Morgan's pilot's wings, Jim Varinis's, his bracelet. So this is a bracelet he got while he was in flight training in the States, and he wore that bracelet through his entire combat tour. So that was in the airplane over the skies of Europe, and now displayed in the shadow of the Memphis Belle. And then Scott Miller, the forgotten Memphis Belle crew member. The first donation that came in when we started seeking donations was from the Miller family, and they were just incredible. They were so generous. They had a Foot Locker, and they said, you can have all of it. And it was just amazing. And thanks to the generosity of the Memphis Belle families, because they allow the Air Force to share these and preserve these artifacts and share them with the public, not just now, but for generations to come. On the bottom left, there you see it's Bill Winchell's ditty bag and one of his flight uniforms, one of his flight suits. And then the right, those boots, those were particularly prized by crewmen. They're British flight boots, and they're very comfortable and very warm. And Bob Hansen wore those while he was flying missions on the Memphis Belle. And having warm boots was particularly important because it got as cold as 50 degrees below zero on those airplanes at 25, 26, 27,000 feet. So those were prized possessions, and about 3 or 4 of the Memphis Belle crew managed to get their hands on some British flight boots. And on the left is a wartime uniform from William Weiler, and his family was just wonderful. They donated a complete uniform of his, and this particular uniform was one that he wore when he had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, and then he shot a movie called Thunderbolt, which is about P-47 operations in Italy towards the end of the war. Another great film, and it's out there on YouTube if you look for it. And then the right-hand side is a Order of the Rigid Digit Medal. And yes, that's a hand with a finger extended. And Colonel Ray, thankfully, he donated a large collection to the museum in the 70s. And this material was in storage for decades. And in this collection was this Order of the Rigid Digit. And Ray had a great sense of humor. It's remarkable that he was able to have a sense of humor, losing so many crews. And but in the pictures and in the film, a lot of times you see him smiling. And he thought, yeah, let's come up with the screw up award. If somebody screws up, we'll give them an Order of the Rigid Digit, and we'll all have a laugh about it. Well, unbeknownst to him, at what was to be a ceremony to award the very first Order of the Rigid Digit to somebody else, everyone was in on this joke except for Ray. They had this medal made for him, and when he got ready to present it to somebody else, they presented it to him. And this particular one is made out of silver, and it was the one that was given to him. And thankfully, he donated it to the museum in the 70s, and that's on display with the Memphis Belle and some of his other things today. So with that, I'd like to entertain any questions you might have. I'd be happy to try and answer them. And in closing, I just want to mention again, the Memphis Belle is one of our great national treasures, our great national icons, and one of the great icons for the U.S. Air Force.
Jeff, thank you so much for the presentation this evening. Thank you everyone out there for bearing with us as we move through a series of audio issues. But it sounds like we got it all cleaned up and the phone was the right answer. Jeff, we do have a bunch of questions here. Let's start with one that's come up a couple of times. The Belle is red and blue when painted on different sides. The dress or swimsuit on the nose art is different depending on the side of the airplane. Why is that?
That's the $1 million question. And after more than 15 years of research and actually another 30 years of research by Dr. Harry Friedman down in Memphis, we don't know. And what we do know is that the original Memphis Belle nose art was painted in Maine when the airplane was in Maine before it went over. And we believe that it was painted by a professional sign painter, but we don't have any evidence of that. And so it's anyone's guess as to why it's red on one side and blue on the other. People have made the supposition that maybe he ran out of paint. But what's interesting is that it's not just the bathing suit that's different. There are some detailed differences, like the figure on the left has blonde hair and the figure on the right has brown hair. And then there are some other detailed differences with the shoes and a few other things. So it leads one to think that perhaps the nose art on the right was painted by somebody else. But in the end, that might be something that just will be lost to time because the people who did it just aren't around anymore and there are no records.
You mentioned that the airplane departed for Europe from Maine. I think amidst the audio challenges we were having, we may have missed some of what you said about the airplane prior to deployment. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about where the airplane was built and the journey it took to go overseas?
Sure. So the Memphis Belle was built at Boeing in Washington. It was accepted by the Army Air Forces on the 15th of July, 1942. It then went to a modification center in Pennsylvania, a place called Middletown. And then in the summer of 42, in August, it went to the 91st Bomb Group at Dow. And then in the fall, it departed from Bangor, Maine, in September of 42 and flew over to the UK.
Jeff, the picture you're showing at the moment on your question slide, I think contains another couple of the questions. There are stars painted above the bombs, and they're different colors. You mentioned that a few extra ones were added and that you weren't really sure why, but do you know why the ones that were there as of the 25th mission were applied?
Yes, so we know what the red stars are. The red stars indicated when the Memphis Belle was group lead. And what made it kind of challenging with figuring that out is that the bomb you see on the very left, that was not the first bomb that was painted on the Memphis Belle. The first bomb was underneath that device with the shadow above the bombs. I'm kind of circling it here. And then some were added to the left and some were added to the right sort of haphazardly. But there's a spot where there's 3 red stars in a row, and I'm circling that with the pointer. And there were 3 missions in the row that the Memphis Belle was the group lead. So basically the lead aircraft typically would have the group commander or deputy group commander or squadron commander aboard. And the number of red stars matches with the number of times that the Memphis Belle was group lead. So the yellow stars are the ones that we have a problem. It's been said that the yellow stars were when the Memphis Belle was squadron lead, but that doesn't match up. And we know when the Belle was squadron lead. What I believe that the yellow stars meant is that's when it was deputy group lead, which is basically the backup airplane. So if group lead goes down or has to abort, then deputy group lead takes over. But unfortunately, in spite of 15 years of looking for that information, I have not been able to find any source that lists who the deputy was on the missions. So I believe that that's deputy group lead, but it is not squadron lead because it doesn't match up with the records that show that.
I think it's definitely interesting, to know how much there is still to be learned about this airplane and about World War II history in general. Can you share perhaps how the airplane came by the name Memphis Belle? Was it a reference to a particular individual? Do we know more about the naming as distinct from the painting of the nose art?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. So the crew is going to take a vote about what the name of the airplane was going to be, and it was 10 different votes, each with their own ideas, and they couldn't come to an agreement on what the name of the airplane was going to be. And then Morgan and Verinis went to go see a movie called Lady for a Night, and in the movie there's a riverboat called the Memphis Belle, and the pilot Morgan his girlfriend was Margaret Polk, was from Memphis, and he was smitten, and she was smitten too. So he managed to kind of strong arm Quinlan, the tail gunner, into agreeing with him. So that was 2 votes for Memphis Belle, and eventually he was able to win over the crew. So the name Memphis Belle, the Memphis Belle is Margaret Polk, Morgan's girlfriend, and the name Memphis Belle came from the gambling riverboat that's in the movie Lady for a Night.
That's a really interesting story. In the process of restoring the airplane, you guys mentioned that the target was, the day or the couple days right after the flying of that 25th mission. With a project and a restoration of that scale, it's really helpful to have that target to kind of dial it in as to what you want it to look like. Was there any weathering or any decisions you made with the paint that were done to reflect the battle-worn status of the airplane at that point in its career?
That's another great question. So we made a choice, and some museums, particularly in Australia, they have taken to weathering objects to try and simulate what they look like. I don't think it's right, and I don't think it's wrong. It's a choice. So what we did is we elected to not try to weather the airplane. We tried to get the colors as accurate as possible. So, we didn't recreate oil stains or things like that. But we did that knowing that those things could be added down the road. 20, 30 years from now, if the philosophy changes, that could be added to the airplane, or if it could be done more accurately, perhaps. But one of the philosophies of restoring aircraft at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force is, if we're not sure, then we don't do it if it can be added later. Because if we do it and we're not sure, then that's tough to remove and could cause more problems. So our goal was to try and get the colors as accurate as possible, and then leave, if that down the road, if there's a different philosophy, those kinds of things can be added.
I think that's certainly an understandable philosophy, particularly for institutions like the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force that exist to sort of immortalize these things to a large extent. We noticed throughout the presentation, I think several people have picked up on this, that Memphis Belle is followed by TM, which indicates a trademark. Could you perhaps share why the name Memphis Belle is trademarked and why that's important to sort of carry that through presentations like this one?
Yeah, I think that was a conscious decision made by leadership, and I think it was primarily about how the Memphis Belle would be used, and primarily that it would be used in a dignified manner. And with a trademark allowed the Air Force and the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force that if it's not used in a respectful way, then there could be action taken.
I think that's another understandable position, for something of this significance for the nation. I think we'd all argue that it's tax dollars well spent, but is there any sense of what the restoration that was done by the restoration crew there at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, what that actually cost?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer, but I can speak to the number of hours that were spent. There were 55,000 man hours put into the restoration of the aircraft to get it on display in May of 2018. So that does not include the time that was spent since then restoring the interior. So it was a huge effort, and that's a lot of man hours, no doubt. But for something of this national significance, and to make sure that it's done accurately and properly, I think it is money well spent.
You mentioned having kind of unparalleled access to maintenance records and everything for the airplane. Do you happen to know how many engines it went through in the process of gathering its 25 missions? You mentioned it had a whole new tail assembly installed. What kind of reliability were they getting out of the B-17F's engines at that time?
Yeah, I have that information written down somewhere. It's either 7 or 9. Sometimes the engines were damaged. Other times it was like 25 or 50-hour overhaul. So it's either 7 or 9 engines, and it's in the maintenance records what the engine changes were down to the serial numbers on the engines.
That's incredible. What became of the crew when they completed their 25 missions? They did their war bond tour. Were they free to go? Did they join in the war in the Pacific? Kind of what happened for the famous crew of the Memphis Belle?
So 3 of them continued to fly combat tours in the Pacific. A few of the enlisted personnel became officers and stayed in the service. So the 3 that went overseas, the tail gunner Quinlan ended up being this is crazy. You can't make this stuff up. He became a tail gunner on B-29, got shot down over China, bailed out behind enemy lines, was picked up by Chinese communists, was given a rifle, and fought against Japanese forces until he could make it to friendly lines, and he survived. I can only imagine what he thought while he was sitting on the ground in the jungle in China thinking, why did I volunteer for another tour? And then in the case of Evans and Morgan, they actually stayed together and went over to the Pacific and flew a combat tour on B-29s. And so Morgan commanded a B-29, and the bombardier Vince Evans was his bombardier. So, the rest of the crew went their separate ways during the war. Unfortunately, Evans was killed in the 80s in an aircraft crash, unfortunately. But the crew has long left us. The last crew member died about 15 years ago. So, but what was just absolutely wonderful at the opening, the night before the public opening, there was sort of a private opening, and there were about 300 family members from the Memphis Belle crew that were there, and William Weiler's family, all of his kids. Jambroni was there, his family, another maintainer, even Gene Kern, who was the narrator for the 1944 movie. His sons were there, so it was really a touching moment, and we felt like the crew were there with us. When the airplane finally went on display.
Jeff, if there were one mystery about the Memphis Belle that you could put to rest definitively, through waving a magic wand, what would it be?
I guess it would be not emphasizing the Memphis Belle as a first, because all of those firsts have to be qualified in some fashion. First in the 8th Air Force, first 25 missions over Europe, and so on. And that wouldn't be the emphasis of the airplane. It would be that it is a national icon and an Air Force icon. That there's no other object that represents the kind of service and sacrifice for the Air Force. And my hope would be that if the emphasis is on that, then when people see the Memphis Belle, they see it in the same way that, have that sense of pride, like when they see the flag being raised on Mount Suribachi, because those bomber crewmen, they knew what their odds were. The odds of finishing a tour in the time that the Memphis Belle was flying was about 28%. And they knew it, 28%. And the other 72% would have been shot down and captured, killed, or wounded so badly they couldn't continue their tours. And these are kids. And yet, day in, day out, they're getting inside these airplanes flying these missions. I mean, it was every bit as bloody, if not more bloody, than Tarawa, Iwo Jima, these more recognized and understood combat. So my hope, if I could remove a myth, it would be to focus on the Memphis Belle as an icon and not as a first.
I think that's a point that's really well made. We've got a couple of questions here that are coming in just as we start to wrap up tonight's webinar. They relate to other gems in the Air Force Museum collection. The Memphis Belle obviously is iconic, but it is not the only Air Force icon, and it's not the only airplane in the collection up there with a tremendous and interesting history. If there were a couple of others you'd point out for us or draw special attention to that you worked with in your time at the museum, what would they be?
Yeah, I would say the Santu 6000. So that was the aircraft that flew Kennedy to Dallas and brought his body back after he was assassinated. Also the presidential aircraft that flew Nixon to China during détente. The Sacred Cow, which is a VC-54, that was FDR's aircraft. That flew, it circumnavigated the globe during the war. It took FDR to Yalta shortly before he passed away. And also that airplane, the 1947 National Security Act was signed on that airplane, and that's what created the U.S. Air Force. So in a way, the Air Force was born on that aircraft. Also the XB-70, which was a 500,000-pound triple sonic, only two built bomber, which looks like something out of Star Trek or out of Star Wars, a really unique aircraft. There were two built. One was destroyed in a mid-air collision, so it's the only one that's left. And then there's an A1 at the museum that was used on a Medal of Honor mission by Bernie Fisher. during the Vietnam War. So those are some of the highlights. Of course, there's others, but those are some of the big ones that I can think of.
And just to round us out here this evening, Jeff, we have had a couple of questions asked about Shoo Shoo Baby, the airplane that I guess gave way in the display to make room for the Memphis Belle, but also a couple of questions about the Swoos. Are you able to provide information on either of those two projects?
I can, to some degree. The Shoo 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 Baby will be going to our country's National Air and Space Museum in DC. And they own it, and it's being stored at the National Museum of the Air Force now, but eventually it will be transported there. And I'm delighted that airplane will be at a place that's going to take care of it, display it, and it's going to be seen by millions of people. There was a discussion about keeping Shoo 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 Baby at the museum, and the decision was made basically to give NASM the Shoo 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 Baby in return for the Swoos. Now, for those of you that are listening that might not be aware, the Swoos is a B-17D. It's the oldest B-17 in existence. It's the only one in existence with a shark tail and lots of other differences that early B-17s had. It was in the Philippines when Pearl Harbor was bombed. It flew a handful of combat missions, maybe about 7 or 8, until it finally made its way to Australia. It was turned into a combat transport used by General Brett and eventually came back to the U.S. And that is an incredibly valuable artifact. And so it came to the museum more than a decade ago, and for various reasons, it has not been the focus to get restored. I personally had hoped to see it restored. I want to see it restored. It's an incredibly important aircraft, but I'm not sure what the National Museum is prioritizing right now, since I'm in a different position. But I do hope that they can restore it and get it on display, because it's an incredibly valuable artifact, and it's a great comparison to have if the Swoos could be displayed in the same gallery as the Memphis Belle. You can see some of the remarkable changes that were made to later B-17s compared to the early ones, and it also helps us understand that the B-17 is a mid-1930s design. It flew for the first time in the mid-1930s. It really is not a World War II design. It was definitely a pre-war design. And the Swoos, comparing the Swoos to the Belle, really gives one the opportunity to see some of the major modifications they made to the design during the course of the war.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for your time this evening.